Welcome back to Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. So glad to have you back with us. Ready for another deep dive into Genesis.
Always ready.
We're picking up with chapter 16 today. And so let me tell you, it's a wild ride. Lots of twists and turns.
Wow. This chapter hits on some pretty universal themes,
Mhm.
Infertility, power struggles, family drama, stuff that's been around forever.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of, it all starts with Abram and Sarai facing a challenge that feels so modern, even though it happened, thousands of years ago.
Right.
I mean, they're dealing with infertility, right? And back then, that was a huge deal.
Oh, absolutely. In those days, having children was basically everything,
Yeah.
especially sons. It was all about continuing that family line, inheriting property, wealth. But even bigger than all of that was God's covenant with Abraham.
Right, that whole promise about his descendants being as numerous as the stars in the sky.
Exactly. So not being able to have kids created this tension, this big gap between the promise and their reality.
You know, it's wild how this one issue, infertility, sets off this whole chain of events that shapes everything. Sarai, desperate for a child, comes up with this plan. It's a bit, it's a bit shocking from today's perspective. She tells Abram to have a child with her Egyptian slave, Hagar.
Now, we have to remember, surrogacy was pretty normal back then in the ancient Near East, but that doesn't mean it was problem-free, And we see that play out as things get complicated. The power dynamics, the emotional toll it takes on everyone.
I mean, I can't help but think about Hagar, right? Was it really her choice? Did she have any say in this?
It's a tough question. We know that Sarai had authority over Hagar, but we don't get Hagar's side of the story directly. Maybe she felt pressure to go along with it, even if she didn't really want to. I think the story shows just how tricky these situations were, even when surrogacy was accepted.
And then things get even more complicated when Hagar becomes pregnant, like the whole power dynamic flips.
Yeah. Right. It says Hagar started to look down on Sarai. I mean, imagine the emotions flying around there. Hagar, she's carrying Abram's child. That's got to give her some sense of power. And Sarai's probably feeling betrayed, threatened.
The whole situation just seems so messy.
Oh.
It's like everyone's caught in this web of emotions and power struggles.
Yeah, it's messy, all right. But that's what makes it so interesting, I think. These characters are flawed. They're making decisions based on fear and desire. And the consequences, man, they're huge. It just shows that some things never really change, Human nature and all that. We make choices that cause conflict and pain even when we think we're doing the right thing.
That's for sure. And, things really boil over when Sarai mistreats Hagar, driving her to run away into the wilderness.
And that's a turning point, I think, both for Hagar and for God's plan. She's alone, she's desperate, and then she has this powerful encounter with God. It changes everything.
Yeah, this part really surprised me. I mean, God appears to Hagar. She's a slave woman running away from a bad situation, and he makes a promise directly to her.
It shows you that God doesn't care about social status. He sees everyone, even those who are pushed aside or ignored. Hagar, she's vulnerable, and she has this divine encounter. It's going to shape her whole life, her descendants' lives. It's huge.
And God doesn't just comfort her. He gives her this promise. He's going to make her descendants supernumerous. And then he reveals what her unborn son's destiny is, the son she will name Ishmael.
Ishmael means God hears, And that's so powerful here. It shows God knows Hagar's pain. He's responding to her suffering. And then there's that prophecy about Ishmael being like a wild donkey, always fighting against everyone against him. It's like a preview of the conflicts that are coming between his descendants and Isaac's, Abram's son, with Sarai, of course.
Man, there's always so much foreshadowing in these stories. Every detail feels like it has this deeper meaning.
Absolutely. It's like these extra layers. It makes you think about the impact of choices, how God's plans unfold over generations.
This chapter is packed, seriously. God's intervention, the meanings behind names, hints about future conflicts. But before we move on, I have to talk about this one part that really stood out to me. After the angel gives Hagar this incredible promise, she gives God a name, El Roi, the God who sees me.
It's amazing, right? It's one of the few times in the Bible where a person gives God a name, and it says so much about who God is. He sees and cares for every single person, even when they feel invisible.
Imagine how powerful that was for Hagar. She's been mistreated, cast out, and then she has this realization. It gives her hope. It gives her strength in a situation that seemed utterly hopeless.
Yeah, it's a reminder for all of us, God's present even in the hardest times when we feel abandoned. He sees our pain, hears our cries. He offers comfort and guidance.
It's a message that speaks to everyone. Doesn't matter your background, your mistakes, your struggles. God sees you. He cares.
And he doesn't just see, he acts. He steps in, guides our paths, provides what we need.
Sometimes subtly, sometimes in these huge, life-altering ways.
Right. Hagar's story proves that.
So Hagar goes back to Sarai, and just as God promised, she gives birth to Ishmael. The chapter ends with Abram being 86 years old. But we know this isn't the end. The story of Hagar and Ishmael, it keeps going. It echoes throughout the whole Bible.
It's one of those stories that doesn't wrap everything up neatly, you know? It makes you wrestle with complex relationships, choices, and consequences, and those enduring promises from God.
Radio WBCM.
Welcome back to Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. We're continuing our deep dive into Genesis 16, and I think it's worth pointing out a theme that keeps popping up in the Bible, infertility. It's not just Abram and Sarai.
That's true. We see it with other couples, too, like Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. Why do you think that is? Why is infertility such a big deal in the Bible?
It's a great question. Part of it, I think, is just the reality of life back then, infant mortality, childbirth being dangerous. But I also think it goes deeper. Like it points to something, I don't know, more spiritual.
What do you mean?
Spirit.
Well, think about what infertility represents. It's a situation where you can't control things. You have to rely on something outside yourself.
So you're saying it's a chance for God to show up, to show his power and grace.
Yeah, exactly. Over and over again, God steps into these situations where people can't have kids, and he shows that he keeps his promises. He's the one who makes it possible, who brings life, even when there's no hope.
It makes me think about God's timing, too, how it's not always our timing. We might want something right away, but God's got this bigger plan, and he's working things out on his schedule.
That's so important. Like with Abram and Sarai, they got impatient. They wanted to control things, and they ended up making choices with, some bad consequences. But even then, God didn't give up on them. He was still faithful to his promise. He used their mess-ups to make his plan happen.
He can redeem anything, right? Like even when things are messed up, he can make something beautiful out of it.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us back to Hagar, She's stuck in this system where she has no power. She's mistreated, pushed aside. But God sees her. He hears her, and he steps in.
I love that moment when she names God El Roy, the God who sees me. It's so human, we all want to be seen, to be known, to be loved.
It's like a reminder, God doesn't just see our outsides. He sees our hearts, our pain, our hopes, all of it. And he cares.
It's a message for everyone, I think. No matter who you are, what you've done, what you're struggling with, God sees you, and he cares.
And he doesn't just see, right? He acts. He guides us, helps us.
Yeah, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's like a bolt from the blue.
Exactly. Hagar's story shows us that.
Before we move on, is there anything else about El Roy that we should think about?
I think it's important to remember it's not just a nice saying, It's like it tells us who God is.
Yeah.
He's not some far-off being. He's here. He's involved. He sees our suffering, and he has compassion.
It's comforting, isn't it? To know that even when we feel alone, when we feel like no one gets it, God gets it. He sees us. He knows us. He cares.
Totally. That's why this story still matters, even thousands of years later. It speaks to what we all long for, And it gives us hope.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I'm seeing this story with new eyes. What can our listeners expect in part 3?
We'll be looking at the legacy of Hagar and Ishmael and how their story kind of sets up all these future conflicts in the Bible. It's really fascinating.
Radio WBCM.
Back again with Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. We're getting to the end of our deep dive into Genesis 16, and wow, this chapter has really stuck with me.
It's one of those stories that just gets under your skin, isn't it? Family, faith, the choices we make, it's all there.
So true. We've covered a lot of ground, right? Abram and Sarai, their struggle with infertility, Sarai's plan with Hagar, all that tension, Hagar running away, meeting God, naming him El Roy. But now we're at the end, and I'm wondering about the big picture, what does this story mean for the rest of the Bible?
I think one thing that jumps out is how it hints at what's coming. All the conflicts and themes that we see later on. Remember that prophecy about Ishmael, how he'd be like a wild donkey, always fighting everyone against him?
Right. It sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It kind of is. And it sets the stage for a lot of the tension between Isaac's descendants and Ishmael's.
So even though God promises to bless both of them, both Abram and Hagar's kids, we can already see these seeds of conflict.
Yeah. And that tension, it's going to shape the history of Israel and all the surrounding nations for a long time. It shows us that even when God has a plan, the choices people make, they have consequences. And those consequences, they can echo through generations.
That makes you think, right? What we do today, it affects more than just us. It can affect our families, our communities, even people who haven't been born yet.
It's a big responsibility. But it's also a reminder that even when we mess up, even when our choices cause problems, God's still working. He can take any situation and use it for good.
That's encouraging, for sure. It means that even when things feel chaotic, God's still in control.
I like to picture God like a weaver, taking all the threads of our lives, the good and the bad, and making something beautiful.
And sometimes we don't see the pattern until later when we look back.
Exactly. So as we finish up this deep dive, what do you think are the key takeaways from Genesis 16? What should our listeners remember?
Well, I think it makes us stop and think about the long-term impact of our choices, right? What we do today has ripple effects. And it reminds us that even when things are tough, even when they're messy, God is still there, still working things out. And no matter what, God keeps his promises. Even when people mess up, he's faithful.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been such a great conversation. I've learned a lot.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Genesis 16? What stood out to you? Head over to our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/Radio WBCM and leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, share, subscribe. We'll be back with more Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. Until then, keep digging into God's Word, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.